Well, welcome everybody. Well, it's great to have you all here. Today or tonight is another installment of Conversations on Compassion. And how many of you have been to these before? We have a loyal following. So for those who have not been perhaps, or were invited by a friend and maybe don't know what this is all about, let me just give a brief introduction. My name is Jim Doty, and I'm the founder and director of CCARE, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. And this is a center within the School of Medicine and affiliated with the Neuroscience Institute. And our interest and mission is to understand on multiple levels how compassion has an impact on us and also on others. And since we were founded back in 2008, after a conversation with the Dalai Lama, who actually, after it was explained to him what we were trying to do, His Holiness, actually at the first meeting with him, gave the largest donation he's ever given to a non-Tibetan cause for this work. And it's really been a joy and a pleasure to do this work. And certainly one of the most important parts is bringing empiric science to this domain, but also certainly to promote this to the general public. Not only the science, but the value proposition of being a compassionate human being. Tonight's guest I'm really honored to have is my friend, Dr. Dean Ornish. Many of you have heard of his groundbreaking work on how changing your lifestyle can actually reverse cardiac disease and have a profound effect. Also, more recently, on longevity with a recent study, I think was it in 2008 with Elizabeth Blackburn?
2008, we showed that we could actually increase the enzyme telomerase, and then last year we showed that for the first time we could actually make the telomeres themselves longer, which we can talk more about if you want.
And Dean has written a number of extraordinary best-selling books on this topic, and has actually had a PBS Nova series about his work, has won numerous awards, and is an extraordinary speaker and also an extraordinary human being. It's really a joy to have him with us here tonight. The interesting thing is, I was interested in his work in regard to reversing cardiac disease, increasing longevity, but as our conversation went on after we met, it actually turned out that fundamentally at the base of this is compassion and love. And that's what we're going to talk about a bit tonight. And that's how it really intersects. So welcome, Dean. Maybe we can all give Dean a hand.
Thank you. I can say, first of all, how honored I am to be here and how much I appreciate all of you being here. And usually when I lecture, I spend the first, 9/10 of the lecture showing them the science to try to give credibility to then talk about what I think is most important, which is love and compassion. In many ways, all of the science is like a Trojan horse to talk about, to me, what really matters. Most people think about my work as about diet, and diet's important, clearly, but it's like, what's the point of living longer if you're not happy anyway? It's not just how long we live, it's also how well we live. And so for me, it's a great joy to be able to kind of turn that on its ear and spend most of the time talking about what I think is most important and not dwell so much on the other things. So thanks.
One of the things I think people enjoy when they talk where there's a conversation with somebody like yourself is sort of the backstory. Now, we know you're from Texas, or maybe you don't. Do you know he's from? Did you hear that Texas twang? When he was,
That's right, where shit is a 3-syllable word.
And but first of all, how did you get interested in medicine to begin with?
Well, let's see. Long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, I got interested in medicine. I always wanted to be a doctor. I first wanted to be a photographer, actually. I worked my way through school as a photographer. And I went to work as an apprentice for the leading portrait photographer in Dallas, had my own studio when I was 12, and then opened my own studio when I was 14. I was an entrepreneur before I could even spell it. And And then I studied photography with Gary Winogrand, a noted photographer, and people like that. And then I remember meeting when I was around 16, I met a photographer named Philippe Halsman, who'd done over 100 Life magazine covers when Life was the major, and done all these, glamorous things with Marilyn Monroe and all these people. And I said, I want to be like you. He goes, oh no, don't be a photographer, be a doctor. I said, really? Why? He said, well, because when you're an artist, you're always trying to please someone else, and you're always trying to, kind of corrupt your own vision to meet someone else's just so you can make a living. He said, be a doctor, then you can take all the pictures you want. So I decided I would do that. And then when I was trying to be a doctor, when I was in college, I was at this very competitive university called Rice University in Houston, which, among other things, had the highest suicide rate per capita of any school in the country, which wasn't in their course catalog. And I later found out why. And during my first year, it's a long story, I'll give you the short version, but my college roommate was one of the 4 people that year had scored a perfect score on his SATs, his college boards, and he had a photographic memory. My organic chemistry professor, I was sure, had left Nazi Germany and come to Houston rather than Argentina to be my chemistry professor. And on the first day of class, he said, this is a weed out course and I'm going to weed you out. And look to the left and look to the right if one of you won't be here at the end of the semester. And so I got really anxious and depressed. And the more I worried, because I really wanted to be a doctor and I knew I had to do well in this course because it was the most important one, even though it had no relevance at all to anything you'd ever need to do. Which is why they knew it was so good at predicting who would be a good doctor. And the more I worried, the harder it became to study, and the harder it became to study, the more I worried. And so I got in this vicious cycle where I couldn't sleep for like a week straight, which is enough to make you crazy. And I remember sitting in chemistry class one day and going, you know what? Why don't I just kill myself, and then I won't be in so much pain. And I was like, why didn't I think of that before? Because you're stupid, that's right. And I was so convinced that I was stupid that I just managed to fool the admissions committee into thinking that I was smart, and now that I was with a bunch of really smart people, it was just a matter of time before they figured out that I was a fraud, And we were having dinner with MC Hammer earlier tonight, and we were talking about this, how we create these images of who we want people to think that we are, and then the problem is that once you do that, if someone doesn't think you're smart, in the case of that image, then you lose. And even if they do, then you can't really enjoy it because you don't feel like it's real. It's this image that you've created. So I felt like I was found out, and then it was just a matter of time before they realized what a mistake they'd made in letting me in. But more than that, I had this spiritual vision, kind of a Cecil B. DeMille, special effects and everything kind of vision, where I got this clear message that nothing can bring lasting happiness. And so the combination of feeling like nothing, that I was never going to amount to anything because I was stupid, and even if I did, it wouldn't matter anyway, was like profoundly depressing. And so I just decided I was going to kill myself, and I made plans to do it, and I was going to get really drunk and run my car into the side of a bridge, and then everybody would think I just got drunk and people wouldn't know. And I got so run down that I got this really bad case of infectious mononucleosis. And I didn't have the energy to kill myself. And my parents got wind that all was not right with their son. They came down and saw what a mess I was. So I went home to Dallas, and this was back in 1971, early 72. And my plan was to get well enough to kill myself. And so meanwhile, my older sister, who had been kind of a child of the 60s, had studied with an ecumenical yoga teacher named Swami Satchidananda. And there's an old spiritual teaching, I'm sure you've heard, that when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and that was certainly true for me. So my parents decided they would have a cocktail party for the Swami. This was in Dallas in 1971, 72. And so in walks this guy, looks like Central Casting's idea of a Swami. He opened Woodstock, if you ever saw the movie Woodstock, large saffron robes and a long white beard, kind of like what you think a Swami should look like. And he came into our living room and he gave a little satsang, a lecture, and he started off by saying, nothing can bring you lasting happiness, which I said, wow, this is so great, because everybody else said, oh, sure, just, get rich and famous and all the usual things, you'll be happy. And I knew that wasn't true, but I felt validated because he was the first one to say that, except I looked at him and he was glowing and I was ready to kill myself. I said, what am I missing here? So he went on to say what really, it sounds like a new age cliche, but it totally saved my life and turned my life around, which is that nothing can bring lasting happiness, but you have it already, and you don't have to get it from outside yourself. In fact, that the goal of all these spiritual practices, once you get past all the rituals that people kill themselves over, the differences, that the goal of all spiritual practices is not that they bring you a sense of peace and happiness and health, but rather they help us quiet down our mind and body enough to experience what's already there. And that may sound like semantics, but it's all the difference in the world. Because if it's something you have to get, then everybody who has what you think you need has control over your well-being. But if you have it already, then the question changes completely. It's not, how can I get what I don't have? How can I do well in organic chemistry so that I can go to medical school, so that people will love and respect me, and then I'll be happy? But rather, what am I doing that's disturbing my own inner sense of peace and joy and well-being? And so I thought, okay. In fact, years later, he loved to make puns, this Swami, and he became my teacher for 40 years, and we talked like once a week for 40 years. And people would say, what are you, a Hindu? He'd say, no, I'm an undu. And that's really the goal, is that these practices quiet down your mind and body so that you can experience what's already there. And then what I think is really the ultimate irony, we end up running after all these things that we think are going to bring us what we could have already if we just stop doing that. And in the process of running after these things, we end up disturbing what's already there. And so that at the end of a yoga class or a meditation, to remind yourself that these techniques are not like Valium in another form, but rather they help us quiet down so we can experience what's there already. And then once you experience that sense of inner peace, you can then go out in the world and accomplish even more, but the intention behind it is very different. It's not to get something that you think is going to make you happy, but rather, you've got that already. It's just that's what you do. That's just part of the fun. And there's an old Zen proverb, I'm sure you've heard, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. You still do the same things, but the intention behind it is very different. And for me, the ultimate paradox was when I felt like I had to do well to feel that sense of love and connection, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't read a headline on a newspaper and tell you 10 minutes later what it said. But once I really kind of began to even just get a taste of that, I did really well. And I figured, okay, let me try this. I can always go to plan B and kill myself. So I became a vegetarian. I began meditating, and I couldn't even sit still long enough to meditate, so I'd do walking meditations. And I began to get little glimpses of that. Now later, when I became a doctor, and I began to talk to patients, I realized that so many of them were struggling with the same issues. The number one category of prescription drugs the last 30 years is not cholesterol-lowering drugs, it's antidepressants. There are a lot of depressed people out there. And they'd say things like, I really feel lonely, I really feel unhappy. If only I had more whatever, then I'd be happy. And then you can fill out that blank with more money, more power, more beauty, more accomplishment, whatever it happens to be. Now, once you set up that view of the world, then you're going to feel bad. Until you get it, you're going to be stressed. If somebody else gets it and you don't, then you're really stressed, and it kind of reinforces that kind of zero-sum game. The more you get, the less there is from me, and I better, it's very competitive. But even if you get it, it's very seductive, because in the moment it's like, I got it, it's mine, I'm happy. But invariably, it's never enough. It's either now what? One patient said, I can't even enjoy the view from the mountain I've climbed, I'm already looking over at the next one. Or so what? Big deal. It doesn't really provide that lasting sense of meaning. And so people say things like, well, I make sure I've got a dozen goals and projects going at the same time. So because the letdown that comes from not getting what I think is going to make me happy is so great, I can immediately shift my attention to something else. And you and I have had the good fortune to, consult with not only the most destitute, but some of the most, successful people on the planet, people who are known by one name. And they generally are not the happiest people. If money and power and fame were enough to make people happy, they should be the happiest people on the planet, and they're generally not. And if they are, it's despite those things, not because of them. And in some ways, I find it's harder to get to the end of that myth and find that it doesn't provide. If you've got $1 billion, you can't tell yourself, just if I had a little more money, then I'd be happy, Or if you're on every magazine cover, you can't say, if I had just a little more fame, I'd be happy. And so at least before you had the myth, and now it's like, what do I do? And so it's kind of a long-winded answer to how I got interested in being a doctor.
I think we're done.
Sorry.
Well, it is sort of interesting how, and we were talking about this earlier, where I said I'd seen a cartoon, and it shows these two people talking, and the one person is saying, now I have to decide who I'm going to project myself to this other person to match the projection that they made of who they are. And this is what a lot of people do, right? I mean, this is, we have a tendency, instead of being open and authentic oftentimes, we meet somebody and we end up trying to project what we want them to think of us versus oftentimes who we are. And it takes an immense amount of psychic energy.
It's true, but you know, what I find is that the privilege of being a doctor is you get to work with people and their suffering. And I used to the Swami, I'd say, you know, I'm hurting so bad, and he'd go, good. I said, it's not good, it's bad. He goes, no, it's good, because he says, when you get tired of banging your head against the wall, you'll stop doing it. You know, the pain is not the problem, the pain is information, it's the teacher. And change is hard, you know, but if you're hurting badly enough, suddenly the idea of change becomes more appealing. It's kind of like, wow, this stuff is so weird, and meditation and yoga and vegetarian diet and all this stuff. But boy, I'm in such pain, I'm hurting so badly. Let me try this weird stuff. And then because these underlying biological mechanisms are so dynamic, you can feel so much better so quickly. I hear people all the time saying things to me like, having a heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to me, or being diagnosed with prostate cancer or breast cancer was a good thing. And you go, what, are you crazy? And they say, no, that's what it took to get my attention to begin transforming my life. And so, again, diet is important and so on, but what really makes our program work, and what really I find the most meaningful and why I'm so passionate about doing it, it's kind of a conspiracy of love. All this stuff is like a Trojan horse to enable to talk about what really matters the most. If I went, you know, Medicare is now covering our program after 16 years, and if I went to Medicare and said, we want to teach people to be more compassionate and loving towards themselves and others, and rediscover inner sources of peace and joy and health and well-being, you know, they'd say, you know, you're out of here, buddy. I mean, even now with all the PET scans and angiograms and, you know, radionuclide ventriculograms and all these sophisticated state-of-the-art measures, you know, we're using these very high-tech, expensive state-of-the-art technologies to prove the power of these very ancient ideas and wisdom. But for me, that's what enables, that's why I love doing this work. So our support groups, for example, are not where people exchange recipes and shopping tips and so on. I mean, sometimes that happens, but the main essence of it is the idea that anything that brings us together is healing. Even the word healing comes from the root to make whole, you know, to yoga, to yoke, to unite. These are very old ideas that we're kind of rediscovering. And so in our support groups, what we do is we create a safe environment for people to, you know, those personas that you talked about a moment ago, you know, you know, here's my resume, I'm worthy of your love and respect, is for people to let down. It's not that you should never have a good resume, but if you have nowhere that feels safe enough to really be authentic, and no one that you trust enough to be open and intimate with, then those same walls that protect us isolate us. And ironically, the very thing that we think we're doing to protect ourselves is the very thing that's killing us. Because I wrote a book years ago called Love and Survival that reviewed what were then hundreds and now thousands of studies showing that people who are lonely and depressed and isolated are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely from all causes than those who have that sense of love and connection and community. Now, 50 years ago, you know, we'd have an extended family. You know, we'd have a neighborhood with 2 or 3 generations of people that we grew up with. We'd have a church or synagogue we went to regularly. We'd have a job that felt secure. And part of the value of that is that when you grow up in a generation, in a neighborhood with 2 or 3 generations of people, they know you. They don't just know your resume. They don't just know the good part of you. They know where you messed up and all the, you know, your dark stuff. And you know that they know, and they know that you know that they know, but they're still there for you. And there's something really powerfully primal about the human condition that's fundamentally healing when you can be seen as in all your weaknesses and mistakes and still feel that that person loves and cares for you. And so in our support groups, what we do is we very intentionally have learned how to create a safe environment. We say, look, to me, trust is everything in life. Because you can only be intimate with somebody to the degree that you can open your heart and be vulnerable to them. And you can only do that to the degree you can trust them. Because everybody's had the experience of opening up and getting smashed, you know, getting hurt. And then the heart goes, you know, that wall around your heart goes, see, I told you it's not safe. And then it's, you know, always up. But if you can create a place where people can come in and intentionally say, I'm going to trust these people. And I remember, well, I'll come back to this in a second. And somebody can say, you know, I might look like the perfect dad, but my kid's on heroin, you know. And instead of somebody saying, oh, well, why don't you send him to Betty Ford? Or, you know, why don't you send him to drug rehab program? It's like they hadn't thought about that. To say, what are you feeling? And communicate that as a feeling to the person. Now, that sounds so touchy-feely. And, you know, and people say, oh, your program's so touchy-feely. And I used to get really defensive and say, oh, no, look at all our hard signs. And then one day I said, you know, it is touchy-feely. That's what makes it work. Because we are touchy-feely creatures. We're creatures of community. And so somebody, instead of saying, oh, well, why don't you send them to a drug rehab program, say, well, what am I feeling? Okay, I'm feeling sad. Well, I'm feeling sad to hear that, or my kid has another problem, or I used to have a drug problem, whatever it happens to be. And suddenly it doesn't fix the problem of the kid on heroin or whatever that happens to be, but suddenly you don't feel so alone and ashamed anymore. And there's something so primally healing about that experience that in our studies, we would recruit people who just happened to be getting a special test called an angiogram at a certain lab at a certain day, when we were recruiting people. And these are people who not only didn't particularly like each other, they often hated each other when they first started. I mean, literally, the very first day of the very first study I did back in 1977, 37 years ago, we had 10 men and women in a hotel. I took a year off between my second and third years of medical school. I was learning how to do bypass surgery with Michael DeBakey, the heart surgeon. We'd cut people open, we'd bypass their clogged arteries. He'd tell them they were cured, they'd go home and smoke cigarettes and eat junk food and not manage stress, not exercise, and more often than not, their bypasses would clog up, and we'd cut them open again. I said, there's got to be a better way. So I took 10 men and women, put them in a hotel, and we were going to put them on this program. And one of them was this older guy, a 75-year-old guy who was homophobic, and another guy was, of course, was gay. And the older guy said something really awful to the younger guy in the very first time they met, and the younger guy said something equally awful back. And they started yelling at each other. One got chest pain, took a nitroglycerin. The other got chest pain, took a Demerol. Clutched their chest, slammed the door. I thought, man, these guys are going to die, and this is going to be the end of my very short research career. And I talked to them. I said, look, you're giving the power to give you chest pain and maybe even a heart attack and maybe to die to the person you hate the most. That's not really smart. To get out of this sense of, these false choices. Am I going to look out for number one, or am I going to be, Mother Teresa? Am I going to look out for myself, or am I going to be compassionate and help other people? And you realize that that's a false choice. It's kind of like, the classic example when you're on the airplane and they said, if the cabin depressurizes and the oxygen mask come down, put it on yourself first, right? Is that selfish? Well, no, because if you've got a young kid, they don't know what to do, then you're both going to die. But if you put it on yourself, then you can be in a position to help the others. So I said, look, so I talked to them separately and I said, I want you to be more compassionate and loving to each other, not for some external or extrinsic reward, not for good karma or to get a gold star or to go to heaven, but that's what's going to free you from your pain right here, right now. Not just your angina, your chest pain, but the deeper pain, the depression, the loneliness. And so they did. And in the second study, and they didn't have any more pain the rest of it. In fact, I did things I wouldn't do. I was a medical student, I didn't know better. I'd ask them every day I'd give them a little homework assignment, do each other's laundry, or stuff like that, I don't do that anymore. But, but the second study, same thing. We had this guy named Dwayne Butler who's given me permission to use his name. I wrote a chapter in the Reversing Heart Disease book about him. And this gay Episcopal priest named Robert, and the same thing. He used to beat people. He said, I used to beat people up for fun like you. People up like you for fun, because he was a self-described redneck. And by the end of the first week, they were hugging, And so for me, that's really the miracle. That's the transformation, is that if we can teach people how being compassionate is the most selfish thing you can do, because that's what frees us from our suffering and our pain, then it becomes sustainable. If it's for some external reward, then we're back in the same place that I was when I was in college, thinking we have to get this from outside. But if we can show people that that's really the path to not only transforming their lives, but transforming our lives, then it creates a sense of meaning to the pain and allows us to use that as a doorway or as a window for transforming our lives.
It's interesting because people ask, geez, what's it like to be in the presence of the Dalai Lama or to spend time with the Dalai Lama? And in some ways, it's really the epitome of what we're talking about because, again, you look at a place like Stanford, which some people might call competitive.
You think?
And, every interaction is one, well, what do they want from me? What's the agenda here? Is there a subtext? Is the question they're asking really the question they want answered? What's really going on here? And, all of this costs time, energy, and effort, and it creates anxiety. When you're in the presence of somebody like the Dalai Lama, it's extraordinary, and people like him. Because as soon as you're in this person's presence, you don't have to be anything.
You resonate with him.
Yeah, because there is no expectation other than, I love you because you're a fellow human being, and you don't have to hide who you are, what you are, you don't have to impress. And it's as soon as that happens, and with people like him, it's like this incredible barriers let down, you're almost at peace, and it's an extraordinary feeling. And it's one, though, that you don't have to have those people. You just have to be that way yourself. And it's amazing how these doors open. And suddenly, I was giving a talk earlier today, and I was saying it's extraordinary how you look at two people, and it'll be raining outside. One person will walk outside, and they'll say, damn it, my suit's wet, there's going to be traffic, it's just another screwed up day, and it's just ruined the rest of my day, et cetera, et cetera. You'll have another person go out, and they'll say, look at the warmth outside, the rain is coming, we've been in a drought, it's feeding all the plants, it's nourishing everything. God, I'm so happy to be alive. Yet they both had the exact same
I have
experience.
this cartoon of this father and son in their car, and they're at a railroad crossing waiting for and the train's going by, and the father's going, God damn it, I got to wait for this train. And the son's going, Daddy, we get to watch this train go by, Same thing.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So after you, though, did this work, and it had this profound effect, did you have, and you become world famous, and you have advised former President Clinton on actually his own issues related to reversing cardiac disease, and a number of other people. What has kept you centered in the world where we talk about people who sort of get lost in their own?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I guess it's that same spiritual practice that we talked about earlier. I still get anxious and depressed and worried like everybody does, but I've learned to catch myself and to say, okay, what am I doing that's causing this? And therefore, what can I do to free myself from this? And to have that same kind of compassion for myself, it's much harder for me to have compassion for myself than for other people. How many of you find it's easier to forgive somebody else than to forgive yourself? I'm just curious. Yeah, see, that's same with me. And I'll share a story with you that when I was a medical student and I decided that I would take this workshop with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who became famous about the 5 stages of dying, and I figured, well, I'm going to be a doctor and I'm going to have to deal with dying people, so I'd like to learn from her. So we went to this 5-day workshop, and I thought that it was going to be kind of this didactic, here's stage 1 and here's stage 2, and anger and denial and whatever. And she had, instead, she was doing this kind of almost primal scream therapy with people. So I had this room of about 40 people I'd never met before, who were therapists and ministers and whatever. And they'd go up to this, like she'd have a phone book, and she'd give them this radiator hose, and they just start beating this, phone book to obliterate it. And this went on, and it was like, helter skelter. It's like they turned into from this, mild-mannered person to Charles Manson, right in front of me. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. This is not what I expected. And I watched this for like 4 days, and I thought, and by then I'd already gone through that whole dark period in my life. I said, her thesis was that if you're dealing with people who are dying, that it's going to bring up all your dark stuff, particularly your fear of dying yourself. And if you haven't dealt with that, then you can't really help the other person, because you can't really be compassionate if it resonates with stuff that you haven't dealt with. If it brings up your own discomfort, they're going to sense it, and they're going to not really be open with you, and then you can't really help them as much, which is true, I think. But I figured I was pretty much in touch with my demons already, having gone through that horrible experience when I was in college, so I didn't really feel like I needed to do that, because I was like, a little halo on my head. And so, but on the last day, my little inner voice, and by the way, just to digress for a moment, one of the most powerful things that I learned is that when you quiet down your mind and body, not only do you experience that inner sense of peace, but you get to hear your own inner wisdom, your own inner guru, if you will, your inner teacher. It's the voice that speaks very clearly but very quietly. Sometimes it's called the still small voice within in various spiritual traditions. It's the one that wakes you up at 4 a.m. and says, hey, listen up, pay attention. You're not doing something that's in your best interest. You know what I'm talking about? And so I learned to really, that I could intentionally get in touch with that voice and so at the end of a meditation or yoga experience, I would always ask myself, what am I not paying attention to that I need to pay attention to? And just listen, and it's amazing what kind of information comes out. And I've learned you can do that in the midst of busy life if you just remind yourself to ask yourself that question. But anyway, so that little voice said to me, you need to do this. And I said, seriously? And they said, yeah. It said, yeah. So I said, okay. So I went up, and she gave me the radiator hose, and I started to hit the phone book, and I really couldn't get into it. She said, well, she was very intuitive, and she said, well, imagine you're just hitting somebody, not just a phone book. I said, well, why would I want to do that? And she said, well, think of all the people you've been angry with, And I thought about, my girlfriend at the time and my parents and all these people. And, one by one, and I have a very good imagination, so I imagined them standing before me, hitting them with this radiator hose. And they, it was very real. In some ways, it was realer than real. And in every case, they would kind of be shocked, and then they would fight back. And in my vision, I would overcome them and, beat them up and be a bloody mess and then move on to the next person. I know this sounds terrible, and of course, on compassion here, but...
this is somewhat unexpected.
And so after about 20 minutes of this, and I had blisters on my hands, and I was drenched in sweat, and I said, I think I'm done. And I told myself, I said, I'm glad I did this because it doesn't really help, that only intensifies the dark side. It doesn't really free. And there's this common misconception that if you ventilate your anger, it's a cathartic thing and it frees you of it. It only intensifies it. And that's what I experienced at that moment, was that far from being free and transcended, I felt like I was mired in this darkness. And it was a really uncomfortable feeling. And I said, but I'm done. So at least I learned something good. And she said, no, I don't think you're done. And Elizabeth. And I said, well, who could I possibly... She said, I think you've left somebody out. I said, who could I possibly have left out? I beat up all these people I know. And she said, no, I think you have. So I thought about it. And I got this image of the Swami that I was telling you about earlier. And I remember at that moment thinking that he'd given a lecture a few months earlier about the man who found God through pure hatred of God. Now, there's not a lot in Western tradition about finding God and getting enlightened through pure hatred. But the idea was that, and it made no sense to me at the time, but the idea was that it's when you're kind of stuck in the middle and you're neither, that the extremes really can take you to a really transformative place. Extreme love can certainly take you to a transformative place. But if you're not afraid of it, extreme hatred and that darkness, and that's what George Lucas was so brilliant in Star Wars, when Darth Vader finally came to that place of compassion, But he would have been stuck somewhere in the middle had he not come to that extreme. So I thought, okay, well, let's see if that's true. So I imagined the Swami standing in front of me, and I started to hit him with this radiator hose. I know this is going to sound terrible, but just stay with me for a moment. And it was different than everyone else. Instead, everyone else was kind of like, whoa, sorry. Everybody else, was like fighting, but he would just kind of stand there like this and let me, I think I lost my microphone here. There we go. And so he just stood there like this to let me hit him, which just made me madder at the time. So I looked up to hit him in the face with his radiator hose. I know this sounds terrible. And I could see these tears coming down his face. And they weren't tears of like I was hurting him with this hose. They were like, I can only describe it as tears of pure compassion. And I could hear him saying, you poor ignorant boy, you just don't know any better. And it was transformative. And it was just pure love is the only way I can describe it. It was realer than real. And it was like I was showing the darkest part of myself and only being met with pure love. And it was like shining a light in the darkness. It's like, wow, if I can show, it's kind of like the extreme of, the resume thing that you were talking about earlier. If I could show the darkest part of myself and only get love and compassion in return, then maybe I could have that same compassion for my own darkness. And then if I could have that compassion for my own darkness, then I could have that compassion for other people's darkness. And it was just really a transformative moment for me, and that's really carried me through all these, you asked me earlier what enables me to kind of get carried through. And it was that experience and ones like it that have enabled me to really see that really is the essence of healing. It's like in Christianity, it's like when Jesus is on the cross and he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It's that just essence of pure compassion. Or when you're around the Dalai Lama or other spiritual teachers like that, just being in their presence, you feel that sense of compassion. Or in a support group of people where somebody can say, like the guy whose kid's on heroin or whatever, I may look like I'm really successful, but I'm bankrupt or whatever. And you can show the darkest parts of yourself to someone else, and they can fully receive that with compassion and love. To me, that's the essence of healing, in my limited understanding.
How many people feel that is where they're at, that's what they have, that they are there, where they actually can be completely open with their darkest. Okay, is there anyone? But you know, it's interesting because if you ask people, 25% of people say, they're two obviously who have it over there. But 25% of people say that they have no one to talk to when they're in pain or suffering. Can you imagine? And it's interesting because Dean was saying how we're sort of finding these traditions that are thousands of years old, not only for finding inner peace, but actually health. Yet the people from the countries where these traditions originated, which oftentimes are third world countries, are places where those people want to come to the United States, where we have an epidemic of isolation, loneliness, and depression.
Well, let me tell you about that. I remember I went to India with Swami Satchidananda when I was a medical student in 1976. And
So it fascinates me because if I was hanging out with a Swami at your age, my parents would have really looked at me. Now, but you're saying that he was over for dinner for a cocktail party. So
Yeah.
how were your parents different, enlightened, if I could ask before you?
Well, they were really appreciative that it helped my older sister so much. But my parents were, challenging. They disowned me for 18 years because my girlfriend was the wrong color. She was, and they said, and this went on for 17 years, all the way through college and medical school. And
Same girlfriend?
Same girlfriend, yeah. And, she was in the Alvin Ailey dance company. She was a Harvard-trained doctor. And they'd say, we would much rather you have been with a poor white trash heroin addict than her. And I said, really? That kind of puts it in perspective,
Wow.
And I mean, it was a blessing in its own way because it made me very independent and strong. But it was really challenging and painful.
I was going to say it must have been extraordinarily painful.
Yeah, it was hard.
Interesting. Because on the one hand, you think that type of a personality who'd welcome in the Swami, who obviously is from a culture or race that isn't connected to them, and you could equally create prejudice with that person's welcomed in. Yet on the other hand, someone else.
Yeah, but I wasn't married to the Swami. I wasn't living with the Swami.
Maybe that's a good point. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your story. 1976.
Oh yeah, so you were just talking about how other countries are starting to eat like us and live like us and die like us, and more people are dying today from heart disease and diabetes in pretty much every country in the world, including most of Africa, than AIDS, TB, and malaria combined. And so it's diverting a lot of precious resources away from things that really do require drugs, like AIDS, TB, and malaria, to things that are largely preventable and even reversible through changing lifestyle. And the ultimate irony in all this is that the diet and lifestyle really that we found that could reverse all these conditions is what they were eating before they started to copy our way of eating and living. And so, but I started saying in 76, I went to India with the same Swami, and there was about four of us. And we went to the traditional Western medical establishment places, like the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi, and also the Ayurvedic and naturopathic and homeopathic and all the different places and temples and so on. It was really fun. But in the All India Institute, I was there lecturing as this Western doctor about the power and benefits of yoga to this very hostile and skeptical Indian group of doctors because it was like their illegitimate stepchild. And now years later, I mean, now they're actually doing that. But, it's just funny how these things come full circle.
Interesting.
I was in Hawaii yesterday lecturing at the Queen's Hospital in Honolulu. And while Hawaii is the healthiest state in the U.S., the native Hawaiians are the unhealthiest identifiable group of people in the U.S. because they have embraced, their favorite food is Spam, believe it or not. They're like the most, I mean, if you had to pick a metaphor for the worst American processed food, that's it. They've kind of, again, their traditional Hawaiian diet is the same diet that we found that can reverse and prevent most of these chronic diseases, but they've embraced, the Western diet. So now I, as a kind of a Westerner, are now going to try, and we're putting our program there, to get native Hawaiians to realize, and what I said to them last night, I said, we're just bringing to you what you already know, and it's not just the diet, but the whole traditional Hawaiian culture is all about relationships and intimacy and family and culture and all these kinds of things. So part of the value of science is to raise awareness, because to me, awareness is always the first step in any kind of healing. And you can help people connect the dots between what they do and how they feel. And then it's like, oh, when I do this, I feel good. When I do that, I don't feel so good. So maybe I'll do more of this and less of that. And then because it comes out of your own experience, then it's sustainable. Pleasure is sustainable. Fun is sustainable. Fear is not sustainable in politics or in medicine. And that's, I was trained as a doctor, I'm sure most of you have heard this too, to try to scare people into changing their behavior. Don't smoke that cigarette, you're going to get lung cancer. My dad, who was a dentist, would come to our elementary school and give us the dental cup, which was the thing he created just so he'd have an excuse to lecture us about why we shouldn't smoke. And he'd show these really gory slides of people with throat cancer and tracheotomies and half their face removed, saying if we can just scare you enough, then you won't smoke. But what would happen was it was so gross, people would go out and have a cigarette after the lecture, And so it was my first experience that fear is not a sustainable motivator. In the short run, fear is a very powerful motivator. If someone's had a heart attack, they'll do pretty much anything that their doctor, nurse, or dietitian says for maybe, a month or two. And then they go back to their old patterns. And that's because it's too scary to think that something bad may happen to you. And so when that denial has broken down, you'll do it for a month or two, but it's hard to sustain that. I mean, what's the mortality rate in this room? Does anyone know? It's 100%. It's one per person. I don't want to be the first to break the news to you, but we're all going to die. Is that something you think about most of the time? Unless you're a really enlightened being or you've just had a major calamity happen to you or someone close to you, probably not. And so fear is not sustainable, but love and compassion are. And so I just started writing a column for Time Magazine yesterday. Actually, was the first time. It's going to be every couple of weeks. And the first one I wrote was called Love is More Powerful Than Fear. And I started talking about global warming because of the recent conference last week. And it reminded me about, 8 years ago, Al Gore and An Inconvenient Truth came out and everybody was buying fluorescent light bulbs and driving a Prius and all that. And that didn't last very long, and the reason is because it's like, having a heart attack. It's the prospect of the whole world ending is so terrible. It's kind of like Jor-El and Superman, telling the Krypton is going to explode and nobody would listen to him until it was too late because it's too hard to sustain that sense of fear. But love is something that's sustainable. So I gave a talk at the Army War College a couple of weeks ago for the 5th year in a row, their matriculation lecture. And I never even heard of the Army War College, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This is where they train the future generals and joint chiefs of staff from all 4 branches of the military. And so we had like 400 people from 67 countries there. And I decided last year that I would talk about the power of love at the Army War College, which was a great thing. It was a little bit like Dr. Strangelove, when the scene where he goes, "You can't fight in the war room," Anyway, and so
you can see there's 2 or 3 conversations always going on there.
Yeah, my head is a little strange, but so I realized that I would have no street cred as the West California doctor talking about love to a group of future generals. So I asked former 4-star General Stan McChrystal if he would help me out, and he did a little video for me. We met, we both gave a TED Talk a few years ago and had dinner together. I really like him a lot. And so he made this video on the power of love, and he has great credibility, of course, as a 4-star general. And he said, look, love is more powerful than fear. He said, you can try to manage through fear and intimidation. You can try to through coercion of your subordinates. But you can't scare people as much as somebody shooting at them when they're on the battlefield. And if that's all you got, then they're not going to be there for you. But if they love you, they'll die for you. And, he said that love is what really moves soldiers, love is what moves everybody. And what I told, a group of doctors is, if your patients love you, they're not going to sue you, even if you commit malpractice, It's the most selfish thing you can do as well as the most unselfish thing you can do. And if it's fun, it's sustainable. And because, if you tell somebody smoking makes you more likely to get a heart attack or stroke, that's not sustainable. If you tell a teenager that smoking is dangerous, that just makes it cool. It's like riding a Harley or something. But if you say, the nicotine in cigarettes constricts your blood vessels. So in your face, that makes you age faster, makes you wrinkle faster. Christy Turlington has this wonderful website her father died of lung cancer, so she has this wonderful website called smokingisugly.com, you know, because it makes you ugly, because it makes your arteries constrict, you age faster. I'm 96, I look pretty good, don't you think? And it gives you that kind of gray pallor. And it's the anti-Viagra. You know, Viagra dilates your blood vessels, and nicotine constricts them. And so half of guys who smoke are impotent. And so if you tell somebody smoking is dangerous, that just makes it cool, or it's too scary to think about. If you say smoking makes you ugly and impotent, that's not cool, you know, and it puts it into present tense. And so that makes it much more fun. If you say driving a diesel car or a gasoline car is going to cause the global warming, we're all going to die, that's hard to sustain. If you say driving a Tesla is, you know, you can go 0 to 60 in the same speed as a Ferrari, and it's really fun, and a cool car makes for a cool planet, that's a whole different kind of experience. So to the degree that we can make things fun and cool and sexy and hip and things like that, and it's much more sustainable than trying to operate from a place of fear and loathing.
Well, in some ways, it is a statement to our neuroplasticity, because we have within us this ability to change our brains. Yeah. And as you were alluding to, and I had said earlier, it's interesting how these two people can have completely 180-degree different perceptions of the same event. And going to my own background, which I may have shared with some of you in the past, I tell a story about having grown up in poverty and a father who was an alcoholic. It's very difficult times. And I used to really believe that I had no opportunity, no potential. And I met a woman who actually taught me meditation when I was 13. And this was actually in a magic shop, which that's a whole nother story.
No, you know, I actually used to do magic shows when I was a kid.
But the thing is, after this training, it was the same things in my life that still existed, yet it went from this perception of limited to no possibilities to really having unlimited possibilities. And that's actually really, that lesson from that woman is actually what allowed me to be here today.
That's
and
so
it
cool.
is really the power of...
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. I mean, when I was in college, we were told you had a certain number of brain cells, and you know, if you went out and had a couple six-packs and killed off a few thousand, you never got them back. And what we're learning is that because of neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, that your mind, like, you know, your body has this remarkable capacity to begin healing in every way we can measure, and much more quickly than we had once realized. You know, we've shown that, as you mentioned earlier, heart disease can reverse, early-stage prostate cancer can reverse, diabetes can reverse. When you change your lifestyle, it changes your genes, over 500 genes in 3 months, turning on the good genes, turning off the bad genes. But it also makes your telomeres longer, the ends of our chromosomes that control aging. But some of my favorite things increase neurogenesis. You know, tea and blueberries and chocolate will increase neurogenesis. It gets away from this idea of deprivation. Whereas what's bad for your heart is bad for your brain. You know, nicotine and amphetamines and cocaine are really bad. You know, they kill your brain cells. And one of the things I've gotten really interested in is this idea of how, if it's meaningful, it's sustainable. You know, that like all spiritual traditions have dietary guidelines, or almost all of them, but they're all different from each other. You know, it's like one, you can eat pork, but not this, or you can eat, you know, before midnight, but not after, or after midnight, but not before, you know, whatever. It's like, is God mixed up? You know, what's going on here? And I really think that whatever intrinsic benefit there may be in eating or not eating certain foods or doing certain things, just the act of choosing not to do something that you otherwise can do imbues it with great meaning. And if it's meaningful, it's sustainable. You mentioned that I've been consulting with President Clinton since 1993. And when Hillary asked me to train the White House chefs and Camp David and Air Force One and Navy mess chefs, and he did eat better for a while. And then when his bypasses clogged up 4 years ago, I met with him and I said, you know, you can actually reverse this, because he was told it was all in his genes and there was nothing he can do about it. I said, no, it's not all in your genes. And I say that not to blame, but to empower you, because if it's all in your genes, what can you do, right? But it's not. You can actually do a lot about it. And so I said, why do you want to live longer? Because I've learned that's really the question to ask. It's like, I mean, if you'd told me when I was in college and wanted to kill myself that I would live longer if I just changed my diet or whatever, you say, you don't get it, I'm just trying to get through the day, you know? Or I don't even know if I want to live long enough. And patients say things like, I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes, and they're always there for me, and no one else is. You're going to take away my 20 friends, or food fills that void, or fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain, or working all the time distracts me from my pain, or the internet distracts me, or video games, whatever. So I realized that that sense of meaning is really important. And he said, well, I want to live longer because I want to live long enough to walk my daughter down the aisle and be a grandfather. And fortunately, this week he's done both. And that makes it meaningful, and that makes it sustainable. The same is like, why not have sex with everybody you want to if you can and you have access to it. And a lot of people have tried that, And, growing up in the 60s and 70s, that was like the whole ethos, the whole Playboy philosophy and all that. And people did it, and they said, yeah, it's kind of fun, but it's not really that fun. And Ramakrishna, who, was a South Indian philosopher 100 years ago, he was talking about choosing a guru, but I think it's the same here, is that you can dig a lot of shallow wells and never reach water. You can dig one deep one and reach the wellspring. And the point is that if what you gain is more than what you give up, then it's sustainable. And that the paradox is that instead of having the same kind of superficial experience with a lot of different people, that like my wife and I are in a totally committed relationship, and it's mind-boggling to me. It's like it sounds so sappy, but we just fall more deeply in love every day. And we have the most amazing experiences together that I never even dreamed were possible, because that sense of commitment allows that sense of safety and that sense. And as it goes back to what we talked about before, you can only be intimate to the degree you can feel safe, because you can only be intimate to the degree you can be vulnerable, and you can open your heart and let down all these defenses, which are kind of like layers of an onion, And then the more open you are, the more erotic it becomes, and the more intimate it becomes, and the more fun it becomes. And so instead of having the same shallow experience with a lot of different people, we have these experiences that, most of the time are like nothing I've ever even read about, much less experienced. And so then it becomes sustainable out of that sense of joy and pleasure, not because you're afraid that you're going to get bad karma or go to hell or, all those fear-based approaches that try to control behavior in that way. That just drives it underground as opposed to really bringing it out in the light.
What I'd like to do is actually maybe open it up to some questions from the audience.
Sort of intrigued by the confluence of some of the issues you've talked about. As a young man, being violent, spirituality, we're living through a sectarian age where a lot of young men, particularly, are feeling self-destructive and destructive. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, what you have learned about the neuroplasticity of their tipping points, and what you would see from your perspective, both in the developed and the developing world, could be done to quiet that down a little.
So tell me a little more about that. What's behind that?
Let's say the Middle East is looking pretty weird.
Right.
Some of the inner cities are looking really weird.
Well, I think part of compassion is to, in war, the first thing that you do in war is to see the other person as being fundamentally different than you. And then, there are usually racist names that go along with that. And then once they're different, then you can do bad things to them because they're not you. And so to me, the root of violence is to seeing people as being fundamentally different. Now, on one level, we are different. You're you and I'm me. But on another level, we're part of something larger that connects us. And that, to me, is the essence of all spiritual traditions, is that it gives you that double vision, that you can see that on one level we're separate, but you can't really enjoy the separateness if you also don't experience that on another level. We're apart from everything, but we're also part of everything. And that's really, to me, the essence of compassion. So, and that's also the essence of healing. Going back to the stories I was telling you earlier about the first study that I did, and the people who hated each other. And so and when you really experience that interconnectedness, then you realize that every action does have an opposite reaction, whether you call it karma or whatever you want to call it. I mean, we were talking about this over dinner. It's like, imagine somebody was sending drones over us and shooting people and killing people. We'd go, are you crazy? But we somehow think that's okay, that we can just go invade another country or kill people just because we think they're a perceived threat to us. And invariably what happens, in my limited understanding at least, is that we end up creating the very thing that we fear the most. You know, ISIS, we created ISIS. You know, we created the Al-Qaeda. You know, we created a lot of these things because we were, you know, arming them against the Russians when they were in Afghanistan. Suddenly now they're using those same weapons against us. You know, we're the biggest arms purveyor on the planet. You know, it comes back. And so you can't sow that much violence. Now, somebody say, oh, that's so, you know, naive. You know, we live in a dangerous world. And it is a dangerous world. But if we had spent the trillions of dollars that we've spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, destroying things, building hospitals and some variation of a Marshall Plan or, you know, whatever, then, you know, it used to be that you go around the world and people would love you if you're American. Now people don't say, you know, things that are as nice. And so I think that, to me, in its broadest sense, this is what Hammer was talking about at dinner tonight too, is that in the broadest sense of the word, compassion gives you that vision of how interconnected we are. And when you do something good, it has good outcomes. When you do something violent, it has violent outcomes. You know, the people who are the most likely to abuse their kids violently are the ones who are abused themselves. The people that were, you know, if you're sexually or emotionally or physically abused by your parent, the person who's you're supposed to trust the most, and instead of protecting you, they abuse you. It gives you a worldview that the world is a dangerous place, and you better, you know, hurt them before they hurt you. You know, and so that cycle of violence perpetuates itself. I mean, Alice Miller wrote about that very brilliantly in her books, like For Your Own Good was one of the classic books that she wrote. That in the name of trying to, quote, help our kids by hurting them, we end up sowing the seeds of violence that we're reaping now.
Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for such a vibrant and exciting interview. I'd like to take the last question and bring it right here to this campus. I teach courses on positive psychology and happiness to graduate and undergraduate students, and this week I was really at a loss for words, and perhaps you can comment on this. I had a student who came up and said she needed to, graduate student, drop the course because what I was teaching her was going against her family values and traditions. And here was the story. She said, since I was a child, I was taught that my purpose in life was to be incredibly successful. And when I asked my mother, how could I be successful? She said, you have to work very, very, very hard. And when I asked her, how would I know if I was working hard enough? Her answer was, when you're suffering. And I tried my best to respond to this with an open heart, but I also found myself a bit at a loss for words, seeing her dilemma of coming to a class, learning happiness, and feeling that she was betraying her family by establishing these practices of compassion and self-compassion in her own life. So I was wondering if you have any wisdom to share on that.
Well, she was betraying her family values.
Yes, she
at
was.
least. Just like I was betraying my family values by not being a racist, you know. But sometimes you have to do that to grow. And that's part of the lesson. You know, we're all here, we incarnate to learn certain lessons. That was, for me, a really important lesson, to learn how to stand up to that, to say, no, that's wrong, to live my own life, you know. When I decided not to kill myself when I was 19, I said, if I'm going to live, I'm going to lead. I don't know who to trust because, you know, I couldn't believe my parents, you know, for those kinds of things. And I said, I'm going to lead a pretty messy life because I need to know for myself what's true. And in order to know what's true, if it's not going to kill me and it's unlikely to cause me permanent damage, I'm going to do pretty much everything I can. Because there's a lot of wisdom that comes from experience. You know, when I work with people who are dying, they generally don't regret what they did. They generally regret what they didn't do. Because if you do something and it's the wrong thing to do, that's a great lesson. You learn something really powerful that you don't forget. And I have done a lot of really messy, stupid things. I don't know that I could ever run for political office. And if I did, they'd say, did you know that this person did that? I said, yes, I did. And I would love it if I actually loved it when President Obama was asked, you know, you did cocaine? He said, yeah, I did that. Yeah, so next question. You know, it's like, there's a lot of wisdom that comes from doing things and learning from them. And because you know, you can trust your own experience. And so I would counsel her to say, you know, And you're in a unique position to do that because it's a course on happiness after all. And say, you know, you can be happy or you can be unhappy. We have so much more choice. I'm sure this is what you teach people, that we have so much more choice about, like you were saying before, you know, the example that you gave, or the, you know, the guy at the railroad crossing, and, you know, how you know, if it's raining and, you know, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? We have so much more choice about how we perceive the world than we think. We think that the world is this objective place, and it's not. And anyone who's ever done drugs or had spiritual experiences knows that the world is not nearly, or just studied quantum physics, knows that the world is not only the way that it appears. And we have a lot more choice about how we interact with that world. And so if you can use that as a teaching moment and say, well, you can suffer if you want to, but you don't have to. There's no great virtue in suffering more than you need to. There will always be enough suffering. You don't have to worry about making sure you get your quota of that. But you can let go of a lot of that suffering. And maybe that means betraying your family values in order to grow to be the person that you want to be, not necessarily, you know, this teacher, the Swami, said, you know, we're born fine and we define ourselves. And we get stuck in those definitions. You know, I'm this, I'm that. And you can play with those definitions when you realize how much more malleable things are. When I was so depressed, I learned I could take all the meaning out of something and get, you know, totally nihilistic and suicidal. You know, so what, big deal, who cares? Nothing matters, why bother, you know, all those kinds of things. And it doesn't matter the reality. When you're really depressed, you're seeing the world through what I call shit-colored glasses, you know, as opposed to rose-colored glasses. It's not just having a bad day. It's like things are bad, they will always be bad, and anytime you thought they would be otherwise, you were just fooling yourself. That's what really being depressed feels like. But I realized that I could, just like I could take all the meaning out of something, I could put meaning into, I could imbue things by meaning, by choosing to be monogamous, by not eating certain foods, by whatever it is that I'm choosing not to do that I could be doing, makes those choices meaningful. And if they're meaningful, not only are they sustainable, but they're joyful. And so you can work with her and really make a huge difference in her life by saying, maybe it's time for you to grow up and break free of your parents in ways that can ultimately not only help you, but actually help all the generations that follow. You know, there's this whole field of epigenetics that, you know, we found that within 3 months of changing diet and lifestyle, which includes all these things we're talking about, over 500 genes were changed, turning on the good genes that protect you, down-regulating or turning off the genes that cause heart disease, oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, the RAS oncogenes that promote prostate, breast, and colon cancer, like that. They're so malleable. And when you change those genes, it gets changed. It gets conveyed to your kids as well. So you're not only helping her, you're helping. We called it in my family the Ornish. It's actually the Moskowitz gene. You know, my mother's side of the family in particular. As I said, it's got to stop with me and this generation. And so I have, you know, knock on wood, these, you know, I didn't have the capacity to be in a happy relationship. You know, I realized it wasn't just finding the right person, it was being the right person in order to be happy. In order to do that, I had to work really hard on myself to deal with these very issues that you're talking about, because that was the same message that I got in my family too. We found that 99% of the patients showed reversal of their heart disease by PET scans. And of course, my mom said, well, what about that other 1%? You know?
Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Jim, for calling these amazing speakers. Dean, you made a really good point about Ramakrishna, about the fact that it's better to just dig in one well and go deeper. And I was as guilty as anyone else, trying out 100 different diets, 100 different spiritual practices. And what I'm realizing as I try to help others is that this is a very common phenomenon, especially in California, where there's availability of all kinds of diets and all kinds of spiritual practices. People try out different things, but don't stick. I've told vegetarians, try being vegetarian for some more time, because they think that, oh, if only I got more protein. And people try different things to the point of madness. And I was very much in that camp until I stopped. But how do you go about convincing them to stick with something?
Well, I think someone, I think maybe Ram Dass said, what comes out of your mouth is more important than what goes into it. You know, and if you can lead a loving life, I think that's, and more compassionate life, that's more important than anything. You know, there is, I think, a growing body of evidence that a whole foods plant-based diet that's low in sugar and refined carbs is, I think, the healthiest way to eat. And I know that there are all these studies saying, oh, there's a study that came out a few weeks ago saying that, people on a low-carb diet did better than a low-fat diet, and they looked at their LDL and their triglycerides and HDL and so on. But if you actually look at the arteries themselves, and this was in the New England Journal of Medicine by Stephen Smith a few years ago, that on a whole foods plant-based diet, the arteries are clean. On a typical American diet, they're partially clogged, and on the high-protein, low-carb, animal protein diets, they're severely clogged. But it isn't always reflected in the cholesterol and blood pressure and the traditional risk factors. You have to look at the actual, what they call non-traditional risk factors, things that most people have never heard of, endothelial progenitor cells, which are like white blood cells that are like Pac-Man that kind of gobble up the plaque in your arteries, or non-esterified fatty acids that control inflammation and things like that. And the disease is not cholesterol, it's what happens to the arteries. And if you actually look at that, we've shown in every way you can measure, they get better. And when you go on, and it's not just low carb versus low fat. I debated Dr. Atkins publicly many times before he died, and he was always the low carb guy, and I was the low fat guy. And it was never just about fat. I mean, a number of studies have come out recently showing that animal protein itself causes. This was from in March in a journal called Cell Metabolism by Levine. They found that people who ate a lot of animal protein had a 75% higher risk of premature death from all causes, a 400% increased risk of death from all forms of cancer, and a 500% increased risk of type 2 diabetes. Okay, these are not insignificant things. And there are hundreds of thousands of protective substances in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes and soy products that have anti-cancer, anti-aging, and anti-heart disease properties. Phytochemicals, bioflavonoids, carotenoids, retinols, isoflavones, genistein, lycopene, on and on and on. And that's where you find these protective substances. So it's not just what you're avoiding, but also what you're getting that's beneficial.
So first of all, Jim, so happy that I met you yesterday, and you invited me to come here. Dean, I have known about you for a long, long time. And what you are saying, first of all, I will make a comment and then a question. So comment is that I come from India, came here 48 years ago, and whatever you're talking about, I heard those things in childhood. I mean, in Palace of Jaipur, top 3 things are written about happiness. Number 1 always is, it's big, bold letters. It says, first essential thing for happiness is that you have a healthy mind and body, not body, mind and body. Number 2 was that you have wonderful family and friends, which means relationships. And the third thing was that you are financially independent.
I learned that one too.
But that is, but point was that was third, not first, second. And what happened to me, I suffered a lot because third became the first. So when my company went public, everything happened. I was that fat. I lost 90 pounds. 90 pounds in the last 3 years, right? So it is doable. Exactly what you're saying is doable. I've seen it. I used to have diabetes. I used to have sleep apnea, on and on and on, all gone. So I know it works. My question then is, and same thing is true about compassion. I come from Jain religion, so not just human beings, compassion for all living beings, right? So my comment or question is, there is so much going on in Stanford and everywhere else where a lot is happening in terms of technology moving to help support health. And some of that I've experienced and I find it useful. My question is especially mobile and all these things that allow you to remind people. So have you thought about how to help all your support group through some of these technologies, especially mobile?
Yeah, if you go to our website, which is ornish.com, there's an online community of people. It's all free that people support each other with. On the other hand, the whole quantified self movement, I think, is a little misguided. And I've lectured at Singularity University, which is all about tech stuff, about the power of these low-tech interventions. Because information is important, but it's not usually sufficient. If it were, nobody would smoke. It's not like you tell somebody, did you know smoking is bad for you? They go, I didn't know that. I'll quit tomorrow. It's like the information only takes you so far. I think we need to work at a deeper level. And when we do that, then we find it's much more effective.
But can it be useful?
Oh, it can be very useful. Nicholas Christakis found that we are so interconnected that if your friends are obese, you're 45% more likely to be obese. If your friend's friend is obese, you're 25% more. And if your friend's friend's friend is obese, you're 10% more likely, even if you've never met them. And that's not just obesity, it's depression, it's pretty much everything. And they also found that what connects us is healing, whether it's in person like we do with our support groups, but it can be online. It can be a text message. It can be a phone call. Just the fact that you feel that somebody loves and cares for you is really what makes it healing, whatever form that comes in. And so the technology, through FaceTime and Skype and other things, allows us to have those kinds of interactions even when we're not there physically present. People can still feel that.
But all these things that are coming to wear and so on.
Well, like I say, if it's only a question of telling you what your blood pressure is, to the extent you can connect what you do with how you feel, that can be useful. So if you write down what you're eating and you realize then that your blood pressure is lower and your blood sugar is lower and all these things, then that, to the extent that can be helpful. But what's really transformative is when you feel a sense of love and compassion.
I just kind of have a question that I hope is relevant. So talked about meditation as a way of cultivating love and compassion. I was just wondering about some of the more intense or fringe spiritual practices such as breath work, holotropic or transformational, as well as, say, psychedelic medicines such as ayahuasca, and whether you have any experience with that, and if so, what role they play in cultivating love, compassion, and overall well-being.
Yeah, no, I've done all of those things. And,
great.
And they do take you to that same place.
Yeah.
There are many paths to that same place, and that place of transcendence and interconnectedness. And that can be really liberating to the extent that you can have that double vision and in a way that gives you a sense of compassion, because if you really see everything and everyone around you, and you're right, it's not just people, it's everything as another form of you, if you will. That transcendence is, you realize that that compassion just naturally flows from that. It's not like something you do, it's just who you are. And so you can really enjoy the diversity, I find, the most, and really play with that and not get so stuck in these, things that come and go, when you also have that direct experience of that interconnectedness. And whether you do that through, spiritual practices or drugs or breath work or whatever path it is that gets you to that place, that's what to me makes it. And to me, that is the essence of healing as well.
It's interesting. I gave the keynote address at the Psychedelic Science conference last year.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, though, because there's now a lot of science coming out. And, psychedelics were out in the wilderness for quite some time because of perceived abuse during the 60s, and they shut everything down. It was really, in some ways, giving this talk was quite sad because you saw this generation of really accomplished scientists who had so much belief in the potential, and then they could not do what they were interested in. But the other exciting thing was it's coming back, and now we're seeing protocols that use MDMA or ecstasy for post-traumatic stress disorder and psilocybin for depression. And so now there's a whole new resurgence of this type of work. The other thing that's interesting is, and the way I actually intersected with them, besides the obvious way, is because when we teach compassion and we have courses and mental training programs for this, it actually addresses a lot of the things that people have difficulty with and use some of these psychedelic agents. Existential crises of death or disease, depression, anxiety. And it's really quite exciting. The potential, in fact, we're looking at some protocols using some of actually mental training practices combined with use of psychedelics. So I think there's a lot of really great interest out there about this. And tell us about who you are.
I'm a postdoc at Stanford in engineering, and I facilitate breath work for fun. It's so much fun that I almost want to give up the engineering part, but anyway, yeah.
Different kind of engineering.
Yeah, so I guess just as a really quick follow-up question, do you have any references?
Were you studying with Stan Grof, the holotropic breathwork?
No, I just started exploring that since moving to the Bay Area, but I do transformational. And it's kind of like a mix of rebirthing and some of holotropic, but I have a lot of trouble seeing the differences between the different breath works.
They really all come from the same pranayama yogic tradition. They just get labeled with different, whether it's rebirthing or holotropic breathing. I've done all of those things, and they're really just variations of that.
Yeah.
But it's good to have a teacher because they're very powerful, and you can actually, you know, get into trouble if you don't really know what you're doing. They're very powerful techniques, and it's good to have somebody who really knows what they're doing.
And that's also the same of psychedelics, right?
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah.
I read that somewhere.
yeah. But the point is, though, we're talking about spiritual practices or transcendence, and really having someone with knowledge or expertise really is the way to lighten your own path, because sometimes going these different directions without a guide or someone you trust can be very scary.
That's true.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. I really, first of all, I want to just acknowledge I love the freedom of speech that you express in not only in the dark areas, but in how you express things that bring out the actual feelings. And that kind of leads to kind of the point I was just going to say, which is we live in a society now that is very politically correct. And one of the challenges with compassion is understanding safety. And you talk about safety. If you can't express in a situation where you feel safe, it's very difficult to get to a centered place and to be from a place of compassion. And this was brought home, actually, you talked about TED Talks. There was a gentleman who did a TED Talk, and I believe he was Israeli, and he did a graphic design that said, "We don't hate you, we love you," and sent it to the Arabic side, and figured out that when you really get down to it, you take the governments out, and just people to people, I'm just trying to live, I'm just trying to have my family, I'm trying to have all that other stuff, and so are they. When you find that commonality, that love, that compassion, when you take the fear and the safety out of it, that it's just, it really is empowering. And one of the ways that I sort of understood some of this as well is 12-step programs. And 12-step programs really help you understand what safety is all about and understand how it's freeing to be expressive about whatever is correct or not politically correct, but what your heart.
Well, that's community, the power of community.
Right.
Yeah, and you're right. That's what makes 12-step programs work. It's an example of that. But we also teach people how to communicate with each other in ways that don't feel like attacks and judgments. And there's some basic skills. Just focusing. Our feelings are what connect us. Our thoughts don't. And I like thinking. I make my living thinking. But thoughts really don't connect us. Our feelings do. Let me give you. Can I just give you a quick example of that? Okay. So just trust me here for a moment. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Just get centered. And tell me how you feel when I say the following. I think you're a jerk, and I think you're wrong. Now open your eyes. Did that feel good? No. Did that make you...
I just had love
Dan.
for you.
Did that make you want to know more about why I thought you were a jerk and why I think you're wrong? No. If that were real life, even though it's not real life, you probably still, many of you have a visceral response to that. What did it feel like? I'm just curious. Anybody? Just yell it out. Tight, right? Like, and this is real life. Just because we're short of time, I'm going to just truncate this a little bit. Most people react when they feel criticized like that or attacked in one of two ways. They attack back or they withdraw. They either literally leave the room or they just put a wall up and they stop listening. Now, if intimacy is healing, then it takes you in the opposite direction, right? Now, close your eyes again. Let me try something. I feel angry and I feel upset. Now, open your eyes. Same or different? Different. What do you feel? Did you feel as tight? Curious. You want to know, like, why I feel this way, right? That everybody's nodding. It brings you together. Now, it's not about making nice. It's not about the power of positive thinking. It's not it's a quote negative emotion, right? But it's about my feeling. Now, we can argue about whether you're a jerk or not, but we can't argue about me feeling upset and angry. That's my feeling. You can't tell me I don't feel that way. I feel that way. And it brings us in. You might, why do you feel that way? And then suddenly we're communicating, we're connecting, we're healing, So even if you don't necessarily feel safe, if you can communicate by first asking yourself, what am I really feeling? And then communicating it as a feeling rather than as a thought or judgment, then it allows the other person to feel safe so that they can then connect with you at a much deeper level.
Yeah, that's exactly what they teach as well.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have time for 2 more questions, so maybe we'll do. I'm sorry about that, but we're really running out of time. But go ahead.
Hi, Dean. Thank you for your authenticity and fearlessness. It's very rare and refreshing.
Thank you.
I think my question was kind of, I mean, why do you do the work that you do? And I mean, in other words, like what inspires you, and why are you not doing anything else, and why focus on what you're doing?
I can't be any other way. This is who I am. And I feel I've been living on borrowed time since I was 19, and I decided not to. I really came as close to killing myself as a person can do without actually doing it. And I don't say that to be dramatic. It's just true. And so since then, I felt like this is my path. And this is my, we all have our path. This is mine. And it's incredibly rewarding to be able and to do this sacred work and help people who are suffering in the way that I've been suffering in the past, to use that as a doorway for transforming their lives. And it took 16 years to get Medicare to cover our program, but I knew if it wasn't reimbursable, it wouldn't be sustainable, and now it is. I was talking to somebody recently about how long it took, who knows how government works, and they said only 16 years. It's all relative, really. And my event horizon gets longer as I get older. Anyway, I'm 61. So I love doing this work. It's my passion. I can't imagine doing anything else right now. So it brings together all of the different aspects of my life in ways that I just love.
Thank you for all your work.
Yes, sir.
I think you guys are both a couple of egomaniacs. But that's a good thing. Because I'm just wondering, like, say somebody knows that they should be compassionate.
I feel angry and I feel upset.
Right, I know why.
I'm in agreement.
Awesome. Well, okay. Say you know you should be compassionate in a certain situation, but you blow it and you can't. You feel bad about yourself, But
so you feel, that's really so funny. You feel bad about yourself because you weren't compassionate enough. So just be a little more compassionate with yourself, and then you won't feel so bad.
Right. Well, isn't compassion ultimately feeling good about oneself?
I think compassion is a doorway to feeling good about oneself. It's to me that's why I just love what you're doing here. It's just a beautiful thing Jesus, you're a neuroscientist. You're at the epitome, you're the top of the academic ladder. You could be doing anything you want, and it takes real courage to do a whole thing on compassion at an academic university like this. It's brilliant, and I feel very privileged to be here and have I don't usually get to talk about this kind of stuff, or I have to talk about it, like I say, at the end of the last 3 minutes of an hour-long lecture. So to be able to have this kind of spaciousness, to really be able to talk about these things is a real blessing. So I really want to just salute you for that.
Did we fulfill your need?
I love you guys.
Thank you.
We
I'd
love
like to be
you.
able to spend more time with you too.
Well, actually, yes. Have any of you heard my the alphabet of compassion, if you will?
Love it.
So I'll do this real quick. So I was asked to give a talk at the white coat ceremony at my medical school. Uh-huh. And for those of you who aren't doctors, what happens is that the students, right before they start medical school, you have this lecture. And they are given a white coat, a stethoscope, and they take an oath, typically the oath of Hippocrates. And this is their introduction to being a physician. And it was an incredible honor for me to have been asked by my medical school. And I'll actually share that in the last part of it with you. So I said the practice that I use to be a centered human being and a physician, and which I recite to myself in my own practice, is the following, and it's this part of the alphabet, and it's C through L, which is C being compassionate to self and others, recognizing the dignity of every person, having equanimity, where you have a calmness of spirit, where you're not getting lost in extremes, forgiveness, gratitude for what you have, humility, and for a neurosurgeon, that's really hard. Integrity, living by your personal values, justice, our responsibilities as human beings to look out for the most vulnerable, kindness, which is the active component of compassion, all contained by love.
Oh. It's not brain surgery, but it's better.
And to finish this, though, the way I finish this talk, which is as follows, and I think you might appreciate it even though you may not be physicians. The path you have sealed with an oath will take you to life's deepest and darkest valleys, where you will see what disease and trauma, how they can destroy lives, where you will see what one human can inflict upon another, and more sadly, what one human can inflict upon themselves. But it will take you also to its highest peaks, where you will see the meek demonstrate strength you not thought possible, where you will see cures for which you can find no explanation, and where you will see the power of kindness and compassion to cure human ills, and by doing so, see the face of God. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you for being here.